What is up, you guys? Welcome back to the channel and welcome to my first survival stories video. If this is your first time seeing my face,
Nice to meet you.
my name is Jessica, and typically I sit down here every week and I talk about a true crime case whilst I put on some makeup. However, today I'm going to be branching out a little bit because, as I'm sure most of you are aware, Final Cut Pro tried to take me down a couple of weeks ago. It corrupted my video footage. It didn't save my progress after I spent like 5 hours editing my video. It made me upload 2 days late. It was a real mess, but you know, it's fine. I'm over it. I'm not bitter, but because of that, I ended up falling a little bit behind in my true crime research. So I gave you guys, my internet besties, the choice of me skipping this week or me uploading this survival stories video, which I've had the research done on for quite some time. I'd had this ready to go because I actually planned on making this a series here on my channel last year when I had come back from my maternity leave. But as we know, my mental health tanked after that, and through that struggle, Gruesome Get Ready With Me was born. And with that being such a huge shift in my content, I was scared to introduce anything else new right around that time. But given the results of this poll, it seems like it's something that you guys are interested in, so today we are giving it a shot. With that, I certainly don't want to make it out like I'm the only person that has ever thought of this or has ever put out this kind of video. I know here on YouTube, Mr. Ballin specifically used to do this kind of thing a lot, and on top of that, I am an absolute just filthy, dirty slut for A&E's old I Survived show. And that's actually where I kind of drew inspiration for the setup of this video. So I don't know. Let me know if you like it. Let me know if you don't. I'm very interested to see what you guys think. Aside from that, if you're new and I haven't chased you away yet with my nonsensical rambling and you happen to enjoy this video, maybe consider subscribing to the channel. We party hard here. And if you subscribe, you'll get invited back every week too. And with that said, let's go ahead and get into it. Okay, I'm nervous. I don't know why this feels like such a huge deal that I'm doing something even like remotely different. It literally does not matter in the grand scheme of things.
There's people that are dying.
But I just want it known, I am real nervous. Okay, so our first story takes place in August of 2009, Friday, August 21st, to be exact. Trestle Hawkins, Kurt Hall, and James Phillips had made plans to go fishing together that weekend. They were planning for an overnight trip, so that Friday afternoon, they set out on James' 23-foot Sea Chaser catamaran, eventually stopping a couple hours later to actually start fishing. They ended up dropping anchor about 80 miles or so off the coast of Port Aransas, Texas, which is right in the Gulf of Mexico. Overall, it seemed like the perfect conditions for a nice, relaxing night out on the water. The sea was calm, the men were listening to music and laughing as they fished. It sounds like they were just having, you know, just your average, typical guys' night. They rebel roused, if you will, until about 11-ish before they, one by one, decided it was time to turn in. From my understanding, it was in pretty quick succession that the men made their way to their bunks. Because even though they'd all been having a great time, they knew that they definitely needed to get some sleep if they were gonna wake up the next day and do it all over again. Little did they know, they would not be getting a good night's sleep anytime soon. Because it was not more than an hour after the men had turned in that Trestle woke up to find that their boat had begun taking on water. Obviously, that's not ideal. So frantically, he went and he woke up James and Kurt, who were like, dude, what? Because I mean, they don't know anything's wrong. They're just waking up. They're groggy. If they're anything like me, they're pure evil for the first 60 to 90-ish seconds after they wake up. But either way, they're just very, very confused. So much so that when Trestle told them, like, guys, there's water, James was like, yeah, duh, we're on the ocean, fool. Which, even given the gravity of the situation they were in, Trestle said that that still kind of made him laugh. And I think that goes to show just what a positive mindset these men had, which would really come in handy more than they could have ever possibly imagined. By the time James and Kurt had woken up enough to actually register what was going on, The boat had taken on so much water that it was already starting to like tip up and back. And to make matters worse, it's the middle of the night on the ocean. So it is pitch freaking black. They can barely see anything as they're frantically trying to figure out what the next best course of action is. And somehow, despite their lack of visibility and the outrageously fast pace at which their boat is sinking, the men are somehow able to determine that, and Lord help me here, the boat's bilge pump had malfunctioned. And if you too are less than an expert boater, like myself, then you may also be unaware of what the hell a bilge pump is. So let me relay to you what Google taught me. A bilge pump is a mechanism on a boat meant to remove any water that may accumulate in the bottom. So in other words, it's pretty important. And without a functioning bilge pump, they were going to sink. They tried desperately to restart the pump in hopes that if they did, the pump would be able to clear the water that they'd already started to accumulate and that they would then be able to salvage the boat before it capsized. But to their horror, it just was not happening. So they then moved to Plan B, which was to bail the boat out, which quite literally just means using buckets or something similar to throw water out of the boat. But no matter how hard they tried or how fast they bailed, they were just taking on water way faster than even the three of them combined could throw it out. It was quickly becoming very clear to the men that they were in serious trouble, and as a last-ditch effort, they sent out a distress call to shore. But before they even had the chance to hear if they received an answer, the boat capsized, effectively stranding the men out in the middle of the open ocean. There was no land in sight, no other boats, just nothing. It was pitch black and completely silent. Now, luckily, and I say that speaking relatively, given the situation the men now find themselves in, but luckily for their specific situation, when the boat had capsized, it actually hadn't sunk. Rather, it had flipped and then resurfaced upside down. And this ended up leaving about 6 or so-ish feet of it floating above the water, which the men then managed to climb aboard. So the boat was still floating, but now the bottom was the top and the actual cabin space was fully submerged. Again, not necessarily ideal, but at least they did still have a way to keep themselves out of the water. Can you imagine? You go out for a weekend fishing trip with your friends, and in the blink of an eye, you find yourself clinging to your upside-down boat, fighting for your life. I mean, how surreal that must have been for these poor men. Like, what do you even say to each other in a situation like that? Like, well, that sucked. It took over an hour of processing the situation before one of them actually did speak up and break the silence. And as the sun rose and the reality of their situation began to sink in, the men began trying to map out a plan to increase their odds of survival. One of the first things they decided to do was to create a kind of a makeshift flagpole of sorts. They used one of the broken off boat railings as the pole, and then they tied one of their t-shirts to the top of it. And they hoped that by having this, it would make them easier to spot from a distance in the event that search crews were out looking for them. They then took turns jumping into the water and swimming up under the boat to see what of importance, if anything, they could salvage for themselves. And surprisingly, even though the whole event the night before had been incredibly rough and chaotic, somehow they did manage to find a pack of gum, 2 bags of chips, a 6-pack of crackers, some beer, and a few gallons of water. And that was kind of all they could really do for themselves. They had some food, they had some water, they had their little flag. I mean, it's better than nothing, so they tried to stay optimistic, passing the time talking about how specifically they thought they'd be rescued, and daydreaming about what their first meal was going to be when they finally did make it back home. And at first it seemed like they really weren't going to have to wait all that long to be rescued, as they saw multiple other boats and barges and even helicopters during their early days on the water. But somehow, each time, the trio went unnoticed. No matter how loud they yelled or how violently they waved their flagpole, no one manage to see them. Back home, just as the men had assumed they would, their families did report them missing when they didn't turn up back at home at the end of the weekend. And in an effort to locate the men, the Coast Guard launched a massive search effort spanning over close to 90,000 square miles over a 7-day period. However, sadly, despite the fact that Trestle, James, and Kurt saw the search helicopters fly basically right over them, they just could not seem to get anyone's attention. And over the next few days, they drifted further and further and further until they no longer saw any helicopters, barges, or other boats. And that was when the real fear started to set in. Because sure, the whole scenario was scary, obviously, but at first they had seen so many other vessels that it wasn't so much if they'd be rescued as much as they believed it to be when they'd be rescued. But the further they drifted and the more desolate their surroundings became, that was, I think, when they first realized that there was actually a chance that they might not be found. But even so, even in their darkest hours, the men never gave up hope that they would eventually be saved. So for the next few days, they rationed out their food. They had a few chips here and a few chips there, cracker every now and then, and in between, they'd each have a beer in the afternoon and a beer at night while chewing gum to try to curb their hunger. And given the circumstances, it seemed like they kind of had a handle on their hunger. I mean, to the best of their ability. However, what they could not control was the unrelenting heat. For most of the time that the men were stranded, the temperature was in the low triple digits, and with no way to shade themselves, they developed painful, just severely blistered sunburns. They did the best they could to try and keep cool in the water, but even in the water, they still couldn't escape the sun. Not to mention that the water wasn't exactly safe either. There were jellyfish, there were sharks, there were, I'm sure, plenty of other dangerous ocean predators. Frankly, it makes my skin crawl because, fun fact about me, the ocean absolutely terrifies me. The ocean and space. Those are two things that, if I think about for too long, I will have a full-blown existential crisis that inevitably will end in a panic attack. They're just so massive and so unknown and so just, I don't know, it's scary. At least it's scary to me. On the 5th day of the men's ordeal, as they ran out of food, they began more closely inspecting the surrounding water, hoping to maybe find fish to catch and eat, but instead of fish, the trio got a very rude awakening when they saw that just about 60 feet below the surface of the water, there was a group of 6 sharks circling directly beneath them. So that's gotta be disconcerting. The men started to really fear for their lives, knowing that these sharks were beneath them, because it's like, one wrong move, you slip off the boat and you're done. So as the sun set and night fell, the men began to really wonder if, come morning, would they even still be alive. But then, just as all seemed lost, seemingly out of nowhere, a group of dolphins came through and literally chased off the sharks. Because if you didn't know, sharks don't fuck with dolphins. Because dolphins are smarter, they're more agile, they usually travel in decent-sized pods, and within said pods, they are known to fiercely defend each other. So when the dolphins swam up, the sharks swam away. But even so, the dolphins stayed and swam around the men's boat for a good while before they too swam away. And while there's no way to know this for sure, the men think that the dolphins stayed for so long just to make sure that the sharks didn't come back. And that is so goddamn wholesome that I refuse to believe anything else. By August 28th, the men had been missing for a week, and the Coast Guard made the incredibly difficult decision to call off its search. I can't imagine that doing that is ever a decision that's made lightly, and I'm sure that it was just as difficult when they were forced to sit down and tell the men's families that at this stage, it was highly unlikely that they were going to be coming back alive. Meanwhile, Trestle, James, and Kurt's conditions had deteriorated so much that one by one, they started hallucinating. From what I could gather, this seems to be pretty common when one is lost at sea, and it's thought to be brought on by either stress, sleep deprivation, fatigue, or even heat stroke. But as weird as it sounds, the hallucinations actually kind of served as comedic relief for the men. Obviously, their situation wasn't funny by any means, but hearing Kurt think that he was successfully ordering a pizza while they were stranded in the middle of the ocean, it broke the tension enough and got a good chuckle out of the men. I guess at that point, you hold on to whatever you can. They were out, stranded on the top of that boat for 8 days when they finally decided that what they were doing was not working. They obviously were not going to be found just sitting out there, so they thought maybe they needed to try and swim to find help. But this wasn't exactly an easy decision. They obviously, one, know the potential dangers that are lurking in the water, and two, they know that once they leave this boat, going back to it really isn't an option. So they needed to be really, really, really sure that this was the route they wanted to take. But eventually they did decide that they definitely were going to abandon the boat. So they made a point to start resting up so that they would have as much energy as possible once they did hit the water. Little did they know it was not going to come to that. Because as they were getting ready to swim for their lives, Eddie Yanklin and his crew were boating straight towards them on their trip back from Louisiana. And by the grace of whoever you believe in, even though every other rescue boat and rescue helicopter had missed them up to this point, somehow Eddie and his crew spotted the men and their capsized boat. Now, they didn't really know what they were seeing at first because they were so far away, but for some reason, Eddie just could not shake the feeling that they needed to make a point to go and investigate whatever it was they were seeing. And as the boat headed in their direction, Trestle, Kurt, and James could not believe what they were seeing. In fact, hallucinating had become so normal for them that initially they just assumed that they were seeing things. But the closer and closer it got, the more and more the men started to believe that perhaps what they were seeing might be real. And when the crew aboard the Affordable Fantasy finally did get close enough, Trestle, Kurt, and James hopped off their boat and swam faster than they even thought possible over to Eddie and his crew. Now, Eddie had no idea who these three men were or that they had been missing for as long as they had. So he was shocked when he radioed the Coast Guard with the men's names, only to find out that he had just rescued these men from 8 days lost at sea. Isn't that crazy? They had been missing for 8 days, and they had drifted almost 200 miles away from the shore. And just as they were planning to abandon the boat they'd been stuck on, they get rescued, just purely by happenstance. Absolutely incredible. And what was even more unbelievable was that although, yes, they had their fair share of ailments from their time at sea, all three of the men were in remarkably good shape, given what they'd just been through. Like I mentioned, they were all severely sunburned, and Trestle in particular had upwards of 40 jellyfish stings on his legs. Actually, his legs were so swollen and so infected that if he had spent even like a day or two more without being rescued, he very likely would have died out there. But even so, miraculously, the men were all smiles as they climbed aboard the Affordable Fantasy, especially when Eddie and his crew served them a big fat steak dinner. Eventually, Eddie and his crew met up with a Coast Guard boat who took Trestle, Kurt, and James the rest of the way back to Texas. Once they were home, all three of the men made a full recovery, and they even pretty quickly began planning their next outing. However, they did decide that they're going to take a break from fishing and look into trying something new, like maybe hunting. Now, on to story 2. This is the story of the Silverwood family. John Silverwood and Jean Bora met in the early 80s. They were introduced by a mutual friend, and they pretty quickly took a liking to one another. They had a lot of things in common, but one of the biggest bonds they shared was their love for sailing. John had fallen in love with sailing when he was 14, and a friend of his invited him on their family fishing trip. And Jean had discovered her love of the sea during 2 years that she spent living in St. Croix in the Virgin Islands. Islands. She was originally from New York, but she'd moved to St. Croix on a whim one year when she decided she had enough of the brutal New York winters. However, by the time she and John were introduced, she was back living in New York and John was based in San Diego, meaning that their relationship initially was long distance. Like, really long distance. Almost 2,800 miles long distance. But against all odds, love prevailed, and in 1986, John and Jean were married very fittingly at a yacht club in Long Island. They ultimately ended up in San Diego, probably because Jean still didn't like them New York winters, so they chose to start their life together in the warmer of their two states. They settled down, John built up a very lucrative construction business, and in June of 1989, the couple welcomed their first of 4 children. Ben was their first, followed by Amelia in 91, Jack in 96, and Camille in 2000. John in particular wanted nothing more than to instill his love of sailing and nature and the sea into his children. Even from the time they were just little babies, John had dreamt of loading everyone up onto a boat and sailing around the world. He wanted them to have the opportunity to experience a world beyond screens, beyond TV, beyond video games, beyond computers. Instead, they could go fishing or surfing. They could go rock climbing. Shoot, he was happy to even just lie on the deck and stargaze with them. He just wanted them all to be together and he wanted them to be one with nature. John talked about this dream to Jean all the time, but at first she kind of just brushed it off. And I don't want to speak out of turn, but I just feel like that is such a mom thing to do. And that's coming from a mom, so I do not mean that in an insulting way at all. I just feel like a lot of the time, not all the time, but a lot of the time, dads are adventurous and daring with their kids, and moms are more, I don't know, cautious and practical about things like that. I know, at least as far as my circumstances go, if my husband approached me with a 2-year sailing trip across the world, the thought alone of doing that makes me so uncomfortable that I would like to turn completely inside out. But the more Jean thought about it, the more she realized that she may never get another chance to do something like this with her kids. They were growing up, likely faster than she'd ever imagined. And if she had the chance now to go on an adventure and have this experience with them, why not do it? And by the time she came to this conclusion, it was almost as if it was meant to be. The timing was about as perfect as it could get. It was 2003. Ben had just graduated from junior high. Amelia had just graduated from elementary school. And their 2 youngest children, in their words, were young enough to adapt. So Jean arranged for the kids to continue their studies while they were away. And bing, bang, boom, they were doing this. John headed down to Florida, where he purchased a 55-foot catamaran named the Emerald Jane. It was roughly the size of an RV, and it had 4 separate bedrooms. It was actually kind of an ideal boat for a family traveling with small children because catamarans sail flat, and also they have like netting and lifelines that surround the boat, meaning it dramatically reduces the possibility of a child falling overboard. So John picked up the boat, he cleaned it up, and then he sailed it to New York, where Jean and the kids were waiting for him. Their plan was to spend the summer around New England before sailing down to the Caribbean in October. That first summer was kind of a test summer to see how things went. They figured they'd start off gentle, kind of ease everyone in, and then on the off chance that things didn't work out, they could easily head back, sell the boat, and go back to their normal lives. But as it would turn out, that wouldn't be necessary. At first, the trip seemed to be shaping up to be the dream that John had always hoped it would be. It was an incredible adventure for the Silverwoods. They were awestruck. They were constantly seeing new places and experiencing new things. It truly was a once-in-a-lifetime opportunity. And once they felt like they could really commit to this, they set off. Really off. They sailed to Bermuda, Grenada, Panama, Curacao, Aruba. They went to Ecuador and explored the Incan ruins. They hiked the Andes. All in all, they sailed for about a year and a half before they moored their boat in Tahiti for a more extended period of time, right around the start of 2005. They actually ended up taking about a 6-month break from sailing, in which the kids went back to school and everyone kind of resumed a more traditional life. However, once summer vacation hit in 2005, John decided he wanted to do one last leg of traveling before they truly ended their adventure. Their plan was to head back to Tahiti, board the Emerald Jane, and then sail to Fiji and then on to Australia. They figured they could squeeze this leg of the trip in and still make it home in time for the kids to be back in school by the fall. And most of the family was excited for this. They'd had such an amazing time during their first year and a half of traveling. Why not sneak in a little bit more while they still could? The only person who didn't share this sentiment was Ben. He was pushing 16 at this point, and he didn't want to leave San Diego again. He wanted to stay with his friends. He wanted to re-establish his life on land. He was actually very emotional when it came to having to leave again. But at the end of the day, he's a minor, and he's got to do what Jean and John say. So the whole family made the trip back to the Emerald Jane so that, like I said, they could sail from Tahiti to Fiji and then from Fiji to Australia. But this time around, it wasn't the same idealistic adventure they'd experienced the first time. Ben made sure to make it common knowledge to everyone on board that he would rather be at home. Despite the lengths that Jean and John had gone through to make sure that he would have some comforts from home, like his Xbox and his games, it didn't matter. He was still stir crazy, and he was really starting to lose patience with this family trip. And that, my friends, brings us to June 25th, 2005. It's a typical day at sea for the Silverwood family. The girls are playing together on the deck, Jean's relaxing and reading a book, and the boys are doing the sailing. Even with Ben's lack of desire to be there, it was still shaping up to be a fairly decent evening. There was absolutely nothing out of the ordinary going on until right around 5 p.m. Ben and John were hanging out and steering the boat when all of a sudden they heard a completely unfamiliar, almost sort of clanking sound coming from the mast of the boat. They had never heard a noise like this before, but clearly something was wrong. And as they began to investigate, they noticed that the boom had started crashing repeatedly into the mast. They tried really hard for upwards of 2 hours to try and figure out what had happened and what they could do to fix it. But as the sun began to set and daylight began to fade, they realized that they weren't going to be able to do anything about it until at least the following day when they had sunlight back again. Now, from my understanding as someone who knows nothing about boats, what had happened was the pin that attaches the boom to the mast had somehow broken off, and until they could fix it, they had to drop the mainsail down, which effectively took them from sailing more to just floating. The boat had a navigation system, so they weren't just aimlessly adrift, but even with the motor and the navigation system, without getting the problem fixed, there was no way they were going to be able to make it from where they were in the ocean safely to Fiji. So even though she tried to hide it, Jean was very much noticeably on edge. But given that they were quite literally in the middle of the ocean, wasn't really anything they could do about it other than just wait it out and hope for the best. It was super dark that night, but despite the excitement earlier that evening, everyone had kind of reverted back to their normal routine. The younger kids were hanging out and watching a show. John and Jean were in their bedroom talking about their remaining travel plans, and Ben was actually at the helm of the boat in the cockpit. Everything was fairly calm and fairly peaceful until it wasn't. But before I get into that, I'm going to take my break, throw on my lashes, and when we come back, shit is going to hit the fan. Don't go nowhere. Okay, so it was just around 7 p.m. when all of a sudden Jean and John heard a nondescript scraping sound. It definitely wasn't a typical noise. However, it also wasn't so terrible that they really thought too much of it initially. However, a few moments later, the screeching sound came back. However, this time it was much, much louder. And before they could really process what on earth it might be, it was replaced by a massive banging sound. Now, at this point, it's pretty evident to John and Jean that something's wrong, but given the fact that they were below deck, they weren't exactly sure what they were up against yet. But Ben, who was above deck, knew exactly what was happening as he began to scream for his parents. And all he could manage to get out was one word: reef. John ran up to the cockpit and tried to, throw it in reverse, Terry, but he had no control at this point. The boat was just grinding up against the reef. And as if that wasn't bad enough, as they're completely stuck on this reef, the boat begins to just get pelted by an enormous swell of waves. The waves were hitting the boat with such force that, because the boat was stuck and it couldn't move with the force of the ocean, the water instead smashed right through the hull of the boat. So things are looking bad for the Silverwood family. On top of being stranded on this coral reef, their boat is also now taking on massive amounts of water. So immediately, everyone is frantic. Jean and John are trying to make quick, snap decisions. What are they going to do? How are they going to fix this? And meanwhile, their terrified children are screaming at the top of their lungs that they don't want to die. Honestly, I can think of very few more stressful situations. Things were breaking all around them as waves continued to crash into the boat. Alarms were sounding, everyone's hysterical. John tried desperately with the boat's radio to make a mayday call, but he just could not seem to get any type of real response. All he was getting back was static and faint voices, but nothing conclusive. No one like, "Hey guys, don't worry, we're on the way." So Jean grabs the satellite phone, which theoretically should work no matter where they are. That's literally its purpose. So she grabs it, she starts trying to dial out for help, but remember, she's terrified. Her adrenaline's pumping, she and her husband and her 4 children are in very real danger here. And as she's shaking and trying to dial the phone, all of these waves are hitting the boat, and the phone just slipped out of her hand and down into the water that was rapidly filling the cabin of the boat. And just like that, another form of communication gone. So they're down to their absolute last resort, which is the boat's rescue beacon. So John grabs it, he activates it, and the little red light on it starts just blinking away. The hope is that it's now sending out an emergency distress signal to international rescue services, but the problem was that there was no real way to know if it was really doing anything. It wasn't like a phone. They couldn't actually verbally communicate over it. So they basically had to go off of hope and prayer that someone somewhere really was receiving that signal. But whether or not someone was eventually going to come save them, that didn't mean that they had the luxury of waiting around. They still knew that they needed to take action, and given the state of the boat at this point, the only real option left was to inflate their emergency lifeboat and abandon the Emerald Jane. So Ben and John head to the deck and they grab the raft, they pull the string, and thank God it inflates. But before they could make their next move, an absolutely massive, just like unbelievably ginormous wave comes barreling towards their little boat and crashes directly into it. Ben was immediately thrown across the deck of the boat, slamming headfirst into the 80-foot, 2,500-pound mast that, in response to being absolutely thrashed by the water, had snapped off and fallen straight across the boat. Obviously, he was immediately disoriented by this head trauma. He's bleeding, his head is pounding, he can't hear anything other than the ringing in his ears. But as the ringing faded and he started to regain his bearings, the first external noise he heard is this like just blood curdling, almost animalistic scream. It was coming from across the boat, and without hesitation, Ben just takes off towards the screaming, only to discover something just unthinkable. As it would turn out, the source of this horrific screaming was John, pinned by his left leg under that exact same enormous mast. The mast had snapped off and fallen, concussing Ben in the process, before it had crashed into the boat and on top of John's leg. It had cut straight through the skin and right through the bone, leaving it barely hanging on. As Ben runs over to his dad, a pool of blood just begins filling up the deck of the boat. And I cannot even imagine how shocking and horrible this must have been for Ben to see, and for John to experience for that matter. It just, it gives me chills to think about how bad that truly must have hurt. Ben's first instinct was to try with every bit of strength that he had to help his father lift the mast and free himself. But this thing was 80 feet long and upwards of 3,000 pounds. Two men were not lifting it, no matter how much adrenaline was coursing through their veins. It just was not happening. And right then and there, they both realized that if they didn't figure something out, like now, John was going to bleed to death right then and right there. So incredibly quick thinking on Ben's part, he runs off and he manages to scrounge up some rope and two like really long screwdrivers, which he then used to tourniquet John's leg right above the knee in order to stop, or at the very least, dramatically slow down his bleeding. Now, while all this is going on, Jean is gathering up she and John's other three kids and working to get them above deck safely as well. And only once she was able to get the kids into the cockpit was she then able to go and check in with Ben and John. And that is when she first saw what was going on with John. Now, immediately, she's freaking out. Rightfully so. I would have too. But all of a sudden, all she can think about is how she wants to go below deck to try and find a first aid kit to help her husband. But with how quickly the boat was taking on water, Ben was not about to let his mom go back below deck. Like, he physically restrained her until she stopped trying to break away from him. And in doing so, he very likely saved her life as well, because just as she began to give in and stop trying to get away, another massive wave hit the boat and shattered the windows of the salon of the boat, right where Jean would have been had Ben let her go and get the first aid kit. So here this 16-year-old kid who didn't even want to be on this family trip, within a matter of minutes, had just single-handedly saved the lives of both of his parents. Not that that by any means meant that they were out of the woods. They're still being positively inundated with these massive waves. And for over 2 hours, the night wore on like this. I cannot even begin to imagine how terrified and cold and just helpless they must have all been feeling. It had to have been inexplicably scary. John had lost, I think, like half of his blood at this point. He's getting blasted by these ice cold waves. He's almost hypothermic. It really was not looking good for him. Every minute they were out there was another minute closer to death that the patriarch of this family was inching. And what was even scarier was that he was fully aware of his impending doom. The whole time, Ben and Jean had been trying with everything they had to give to try and lift the mast to free John, even though I'm fairly sure that they all knew it was pretty much impossible. But then something incredible happened. Right at one of the moments that Ben and Jean were attempting to lift the mast, another massive wave flooded the deck of the boat. However, this time, by the grace of God, the buoyancy of the water, along with Ben and Jean's efforts to lift it, all of those factors combined managed to finally lift the mast just high enough for just long enough that John was able to slide himself out from underneath it. And just like that, he was free. But he certainly wasn't home free. He was in horrible shape still as the rest of his family began to surround him. And from there, they just waited. The emergency beacon had been blinking for almost 5 hours at that point, and still they had seen or heard nothing from anyone. They were still completely alone and still stranded out in the middle of that reef as their boat was slowly being ground to bits. The whole family was really starting to lose hope. Every single time that a wave hit the boat, more and more pieces would break off. And they all knew that that meant eventually wasn't going to be nothing left. So it seems like they had kind of found themselves back at the whole abandoned ship thing. They really didn't seem to have another option at this point. The problem was, though, that in all of the chaos that they'd experienced thus far, the lifeboat had blown off of the deck and become hopelessly wedged in the water between the two hulls. And this left them with only one option, which was for Ben to, one by one, shuttle his family members off of the Emerald Jane, through the water, and over to a small patch of reef that happened to be sitting above the water. The hope was that since the swell was finally starting to die down, they'd be able to wait it out safely there until help came for them. But when it came time to move John, he was simply just too weak. He didn't think there was any way that he was going to be able to make it. And for a moment, John and Ben believed that this was it, that once they separated, John was done for. He was going to die. But even knowing this, he was able to find solace in the fact that at least he knew that once the rest of his family got off their rapidly disintegrating boat, well, at least they would have a fighting chance. For hours, the family sat on the reef, staring at the remnants of the Emerald Jane, knowing that when, not if, the boat sank, John was going to sink with it. It was absolutely agonizing, especially for Ben, who felt as though he'd made the decision to leave his dad to die. And then, out of nowhere, around 4 a.m., Ben took off of the patch of reef and he made his way back over to the boat. And seeing this, Jean too sprung into action. She followed Ben back over to what was left of the boat, and with all of her might, she began fighting to try and free the damn stuck life raft. She wrestled with it for what seemed like hours until all of a sudden, out of nowhere, just it popped out. It was a miracle. Finally, they were able to load John onto the lifeboat and float him safely over with the rest of the family. He'd lost almost 3/4 of his blood. His body was in shock. His organs were shutting down. He was still in unbearable pain. But thanks once again to his 16-year-old son, he was still alive. Even so, they were closing in on 12 hours since they'd activated their emergency beacon, and they still saw no sign of anyone coming to rescue them. They all kind of, one by one, began to resign themselves to the fact that despite all that Ben had done to save him, John wasn't going to make it much longer. But then, just as all seemed lost, right as the sun began to rise, the Silverwood family heard the noise that they'd been waiting hours to hear. The sound of a plane circling above them. They were saved, or so they thought, because almost just as quickly as the plane had seemed to appear, it then flew off. Their hearts sank. That was probably the only chance they had, especially John, and now it was gone. And for the next few hours, just as they feared, they saw no other sign of being rescued. It wasn't until 15 hours after their boat had initially wrecked that they finally saw a rescue boat that really was coming to save them. As it turned out, their beacon had worked. That plane was a rescue plane, and it had seen them. The problem was that it couldn't land on the coral to save them, so instead it had to fly back, and rescue teams had to deploy by boat instead. So at damn near the last possible second, the Silverwood family was rescued. John did end up losing his leg, not that I'm sure that surprises any of you, but given the circumstances, John feels as though his leg was a small sacrifice to make for the safety of his family. Undoubtedly, experiencing this changed the Silverwoods forever. Having lived through that ordeal together and coming out of it on the other side, well, it's no surprise that the family emerged from that ocean closer than ever. And for our final story, the story of Matthew Bryce. It was Sunday, April 30th, 2017, when 23-year-old Matthew Bryce headed out to catch some waves off of, and pardon me while I butcher this, Machrihanish Kintyre. He set off around 11 a.m., looking forward to a nice, quiet morning alone out on the water. He had been surfing for years at this point, and he was really quite experienced. He was currently living in Glasgow, Scotland, but he'd also previously lived in France where he'd worked as a lifeguard. So suffice it to say that Matthew was as comfortable in water as you or I are on land. There were supposed to be 6 to 7 foot swells that day, meaning that conditions were basically perfect for surfing. Even so, Matthew still knew that he wouldn't have to contend with other surfers out on the waves because the beach he was headed to was super isolated, which may be great for surfing, however, is not great for safety. Something Matthew would learn all too quickly. He actually only managed to ride like 2 or 3 waves before his peaceful day at sea started to turn into a living nightmare. You see, what happened was Matthew had done a pretty intense workout 2 days before his surf sesh. And if you work out, you know that 48 hours after an intense workout is usually the sorest you're going to be. So all the arm paddling that goes along with surfing, Matthew was starting to cramp up a lot in his arms. So in between one of his waves, after he'd paddled out, he decided to just take it easy for a second, shake out his arms, catch his breath, and then carry on with his morning. But as he sat there for a couple of minutes, all of a sudden he noticed that the wind had started carrying him further and further out to sea. As soon as he noticed just how far he was drifting, naturally he started to try and paddle himself back in. But right as he started paddling, he got hit with a horrendous cramp in his right shoulder, which made it virtually impossible for him to keep paddling. Obviously, I don't know exactly what he was feeling, but in my imagination, I'm picturing like a Charlie horse, but in your shoulder. Doesn't sound great. And as he's sitting in pain out on his board, the wind just continued to pull him further and further away from the shore. By this point, a few more people had started to accumulate on the beach, but no matter how hard Matthew tried to signal for help, none of them could see him. He was simply too far away. So as the wind continued to push him further and further away from the shoreline, Matt started to focus more on passing fishing boats. He tried, but sadly failed at every possible opportunity he saw to try to flag someone down. For several hours, Matt was just at the mercy of the ocean. He tried numerous times as the current shifted to try and steer himself towards different pieces of land, but by late afternoon, he'd been pushed out so far to sea that he no longer had any reference point to use to discern which way he was moving. As the sun set and night fell, Matt was just exhausted. He'd been trying to paddle in 30-second increments pretty much all day, but the longer he was out there, the colder the water was getting and the more depleted Matt was. He couldn't even stay awake. He was involuntarily fading in and out of consciousness, which I completely understand. I think we've all spent a day at the beach or in the pool, out in the sun. You are always so tired when you get home from those days. So I cannot even begin to imagine the sheer exhaustion Matt was experiencing. He continued paddling through the night as often as he possibly could, if for no other reason than to generate some heat. But given that his board was so small, he could only keep about half of his body above water. So Matt was painfully cold from the waist down. His feet were numb, his legs were cramping. It was a mess. And things honestly really weren't going much better up top. The wind was kicking up waves. He was getting pelted by water. Basically, every second that passed, it seemed like things were getting worse and worse until Matt kind of resigned himself to the fact that he was going to die out there. And honestly, at some points, he was so miserable that he kind of wanted to. He thought it would be so much easier to just let himself fall asleep, let himself slip into the water, and just let go. God, it is just so awful to think about being in such a desperate situation that death seems like the easier option. And Matthew was really contemplating going through with it and giving up. He even had a little moment to himself where he one by one said goodbye to his family members, telling them how much he loved them and how much they meant to him. And in my opinion, the most devastating part was he also took a moment to apologize to each of them for the sadness he knew that they'd feel once they learned he was dead. But for some reason, no matter how ready he kept telling himself he was, nor how badly he thought he wanted to, he just couldn't do it. No matter how much of him did truly want to give up, a larger part of him must have wanted to hang on. And he managed to do so all throughout the night and into the next morning. As the sun started to come up, it was Monday now. Matt realized that at some point that day, people would finally realize he was missing when he didn't report to work. And this thought actually gave him a little bit of hope. He hoped that when he didn't show up for work and when he subsequently couldn't be contacted, that perhaps the search would then begin. And around noon that day, it seemed as though he might have been exactly right about that, because Matt actually saw a helicopter flying over the ocean just a ways away from him. He thought for sure they were there to rescue him, but after circling the area a few times, it ended up flying away. He tried to maintain hope that maybe they'd come back. He even made a point to try and stay in close proximity to that area, but unfortunately, it never did come back. So for a whole other day, Matt drifted at sea, alone and scared. As nightfall approached, Matt felt as though he likely wouldn't make it through another night. He truly felt as though if he was lucky, he maybe had 2 to 3 hours left. He was severely dehydrated by this point, and he was starting to become delirious. So as the sun set, Matthew Bryce made peace with himself. He convinced himself he was ready to go, and with that, he tried to just enjoy the sunset because he knew it was going to be his last. But then, out of nowhere, another helicopter came barreling towards Matt, directly from the direction of the sunset. And this time, they were there to save him. Just as he'd hoped when he hadn't made it to work that day, his family had been notified and search efforts had been deployed. Things for Matt turned around so quickly that even as the helicopter dropped down to actually recover him, he still wasn't convinced that what he was seeing was real. It wasn't until one of the rescuers actually made contact with Matt that he realized he was going to live. Matthew Bryce was rescued on Monday, May 1st, 2017, after an agonizing 32 hours adrift at sea. The current had carried him almost 20 miles from the shore he'd been surfing near. After he was rescued, Matt was taken to the hospital, and he stayed there for close to a week while he recovered from hypothermia. Following this ordeal, Matt vowed that he would never surf again, but within 6 months, he was back out on the water. However, he does still vow that he'll never go surfing alone again, which he also cautions others against doing. And with that, you guys, that's a wrap on our first ever survival stories video. Let me know what you thought down in the comments. If it's something that you guys enjoy, I will definitely try and incorporate them every now and then. They most likely won't replace any Monday videos, but I'd love to get to a point where I could get one of these out as an extra video, like every few weeks or something. So if you guys enjoyed it and you want to see more, let me know. If you have a case or a topic you'd like to see me cover, please fill out the request submission form I have linked in the description box. And while you're down there, if you're interested in any of the makeup I used today, that's also where you'll find that information. If you haven't already and you'd like to, go ahead and subscribe to my channel. I put out new videos every week, and if you turn on your post notifications, you'll be sure to catch me back here in my next one. But until then, stay safe and have a good week. Bye, guys. That's fun. It was in pretty quick succession. Ish feet of it, flow it. Dolphins. Dolphins? Baby, what is a dolphin? Because no way did I just fucking say dolphins again.
Curacao.
I would have said that wrong. On our first ever